by Andriy Zagorodnyuk, who's a former defense minister of Ukraine, joining us, as you can see, via a satellite link-up. And in the studio, our international affairs editor, Philip Toll, to add more questions that we need to ask, really, with our special guest, former defense minister of Ukraine, advisor to the government of Volodymyr Zelensky as well. Andriy Zagorodnyuk, thanks for being with us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. Ahead of these talks, then, tell us what you're expecting Volodymyr Zelensky to come back with.
Well, first of all, he will clearly transmit the message that Ukraine is ready for peace. Ukraine knows value of peace better probably than any other nation in the world, and certainly we are happy to discuss this with the United States in all different formats, etc. At the same time, he would probably say that the peace must be protected. Otherwise, it's extremely risky to do anything. If, for instance, there's a package of security guarantees, which we've been discussing for a while now, because a peace without protection is essentially a huge vulnerability, is a huge liability, and also there is a massive risk that Russians may be using this time of the potential ceasefire to group forces and create additional striking groups and basically renew the offensive in some period of time. As we can see right now, Russia is absolutely not reconsidering its strategy. It's behaving as if whatever they're doing is basically acceptable and doesn't breach international law, etc., which of course is not the case. So the risk that Russia will renew the offensives would be very high, and I guess Zelensky would be addressing that issue.
It's been another weekend of Russian bombardment of your country. The damage that's been done was in our report. It's very clear that Vladimir Putin is taking advantage of what Donald Trump has done at this present moment in time. How do you feel about the Trump administration withdrawing military aid, withdrawing intelligence sharing?
Well, we try very hard not to get too emotional about that. Of course, we understand that it's a very difficult situation for us. Unfortunately, the position of U.S. administration right now is that they want to apply some pressure onto Ukraine. The thing is that Ukraine never been against discussions of the potential ceasefire at all. And we believe we were not in a position that we needed to be convinced, particularly with the withdrawal of the support and intelligence. So yeah, it's tough. It's I have to say this is really difficult. And at the same time, we have a massive support from Europe, for all countries in Europe, practically all. And we have a lot of people from the United States like expressing their solidarity with us. But yes, at the moment, position of the U.S. government is that they're not helping us, at least at the moment.
Your assessment, Andriy, seems very fair. I'll say that for you. You seem very fair-minded about all of this, because there are some people who are calling Donald Trump a traitor. At least one French senator has called him a traitor. That's public, on the record. That's been something that's been aired on many media sources, calling Donald Trump a traitor. That's what they're saying. And in terms of what this has done to Ukraine's defense and the ability to fight off Russia, it must seem incredibly difficult, because it seems that the Trump administration is not really asking Russia to compromise on anything.
At the moment, that's the case. We certainly not. We are, first of all, we are staying very diplomatic with the United States. We're not going to any, blames and accusations, etc., because we still hope that we can build up proper relationship with the U.S. administration, and we appreciate their that steps they're making in order to create peace in Ukraine. Because, as I said, the peace is has absolute value. There is nothing more valuable than peace, and nobody could be, We cannot be convinced in the value of peace, because anyone who comes to Ukraine, they see these destructions, they see the air raids, they see the funeral processions and so on. So we know value of peace more than anyone. But at the same time, we don't believe that unprotected peace is actually stable. And we're talking about security guarantees, and some people in U.S. administration saying, well, they don't want peace enough. And that doesn't make doesn't make a connection, because we want peace enough, but at the same time we want protected peace. That's the whole difference. And it's a bit sometimes disheartening to see that we have to explain this over and over and over again as if we don't want the war to end, which is obviously not the case.
Disheartening, you say, Andrei, and I can imagine it must be incredibly infuriating for you, because you are the ones who are being bombed, you are the ones who are being hit with drone strikes, you are the ones who are under this Russian offensive, and to have people in the White House talk about it in an almost disparaging way, it must be incredibly difficult for you to keep your temper. Can I just bring in Philip Turl, our international affairs editor, for more? Philip, so many other aspects to this story. Andrei talking about the minerals deal at one point, what happens next, different aspects. What's your take?
Well, first of all, the mineral deal, I think, is on the part of Ukraine going to be used as some kind of bargaining chip for those security guarantees. What is unclear right now is whether or not that coalition of the willing of European peacekeepers from notably France, from the United Kingdom, from other EU nations is going to actually get to go into Ukraine and take part. That's been something that's been rebuked and refused systematically by the Russian authorities up until now, saying it's nothing more than NATO getting a foothold on the ground in Ukraine, and that is something that they will never agree to. I think one of the interesting questions is that also a bargaining chip with the Russians over the future, bargaining over what they get to keep, if there has to be a negotiation in the future as to who gets what in Ukraine in exchange for a peace deal. Remember, we're still only talking about a ceasefire. That is one thing, but we're still a long way off from actually getting a final peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, and that is something that's going to be a lot more complicated to work out because, as you've been hearing, there's been basically no movement from the Russians at all, and I think the Russians feel that they don't really have to do anything because Donald Trump is doing it all for them. He's giving them the possibility of renewing bilateral relations with the United States. He's been criticizing Ukraine, putting the pressure on Ukraine and not really putting the pressure on the Russian authorities, apart from one little outburst on Friday where he said that he might increase sanctions on Russia, but those sanctions he was talking about wouldn't really have any effect anyway because they're part of sanctions that already exist against the Russian authorities. So I think Ukraine looks as though it is in a slightly better position tonight going into these talks tomorrow. That appears to be what the United States is saying. The Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff says hopefully we can get things back on track. Volodymyr Zelensky says his team is intending to work with his American partners. So it looks more positive this week than it was a week ago. But even so, there's a lot of work still needing to be done.
Andrei, can we bring you back in? Andriy Zagorodnyuk, former Defence Minister of Ukraine. Thanks for being so frank with us so far, because we really appreciate you speaking in such a clear and unequivocal way. I think what Philip's getting at as well is that there might be some that you have to give up. And obviously, Volodymyr Zelensky, you've all been clear, you don't want to give up anything. You want to go back to pre-2014 borders. You want to get Crimea back. You want to get all the occupied Donbass back. You want to basically have Ukraine's integrity as you think it should be. Is there a point now where you have to sort of accept that you have to perhaps give up something to Russia?
It's the thing is that we have to be very careful about what actually may be an enabler of peace, because if Russia theoretically receives some sort of substantial concessions from anyone, that can actually embolden them, and they can particularly say that, well, maybe that would make sense to accept that and then move further. Because, for instance, they already said that the territories which they occupied already belong to Russia, so they're not subject of the negotiations and so on. I have to say this is extremely delicate matter, and there is no rule, there is no like a book of how to end this. It's a whole question of like trial and basically seeing what works, what doesn't. So there is no very clear like roadmap to the peace in this case. What is very clear though, and I have to say that, is that if we delay the discussion of these security guarantees until the ceasefire, for example, the ceasefire is accepted and installed, and then the discussion on the security guarantees will start, then there is a risk that Russia will block any of them. So, for instance, the people are talking about bringing peacekeepers, bringing boots on the ground, as they call it sometimes, getting some kind of a NATO-like type guarantees, etc., etc. Russia is clearly saying they're not accepting all that. And in the case of ceasefire, they could be simply like threatening to withdraw from the ceasefire. And as we'll know, not a single European politician will take a responsibility of doing something which would endanger the ceasefire. And so this whole everything needs to be arranged in a one package like at once, and then it has a chance to hold. And answer your question, yes, I mean, we do realize that we will not be able to restore the territorial integrity of the country in the near future, most likely. At the same time, we have to be very careful because any recognition of the occupation has a risk of another occupation or another continuation of the conflict. So it's extremely dangerous line, and everybody needs to be careful and not to give out Ukrainian land thinking that that's you can buy land for peace. This is very dangerous assumption.
Hear what you're saying, Andriy, about that one. Can I ask you about the mineral deal? Because there was much talk from Trump's office that this is the way ahead. This will be a way of achieving peace and obviously bringing economic prosperity. That's what they're talking about. But is he being naive and thinking that Vladimir Putin would go along with that and just be satisfied with that?
Mineral deal is certainly could be interesting because that brings the vested interest of large American capital in Ukraine, potentially at least. So if it's fair in terms of the distribution of the assets and all that stuff, like basically commercial aspects, and then potentially it could be quite a substantial benefit to Ukraine and to Ukrainian-American relations, and potentially peace in the region. Because indeed, if there is like a large capital has a vested interest in the region, then certainly its lobbying power can help to protect that area, potentially. The thing is that it's definitely not enough on its own. So we cannot say that, okay, the mineral deal will completely be like enough as a guarantee and essentially will bring, will guarantee the peace on its own. First of all, we have seen it cases when United States entered into similar arrangements. So I have to remind that with the president of Afghanistan, there was a very similar arrangement. It never was concluded, but at least it was already on a sort of final stages, and that didn't help Afghanistan much. But also, Russia may still attack Ukraine, and technically they can try to arrange some sort of agreement with US or whatever else. But basically, the mineral deal itself cannot be considered as enough in order to secure peace in the region. It has to be supported by the military capabilities, similar to how NATO, for instance, is technically protecting Europe and so on. Of course, we cannot say that Ukraine will have a NATO-like guarantees, but at least some kind of military protection there must be in place. South Korea is another example from 1953, also worth looking at as for inspiration, let's say.
Andriy, question from Philip Tell.
Yeah, just very briefly, maybe if you could. There's a lot of discussion going on about the incursion by Ukrainian forces into Russian territory, into the Kursk region, and the pushback by the Russian forces right now, which look like they could encircle the Ukrainian forces. Is it worth Ukraine keeping that incursion into Russian territory going, or is there growing pressure on the Ukrainian authorities to withdraw from there to reduce the number of casualties that could be incurred if they stay on the ground?
There is no reason to stay there longer than absolutely necessary. Ukraine was keeping quite confidently those territories until it had the intelligence. As you can see, the withdrawal of intelligence and worsening situation in Kursk basically coincided with time, and that's not a coincidence. That's a direct consequence, because the way Ukraine kept Kursk area under its control, it's basically by not allowing Russian forces to come close to the line of contact, because in this case we could make sure that Russians couldn't basically create striking groups which would be able to harm Ukrainian positions in Kursk. So essentially, this is a similar doctrine like a NATO interdiction doctrine, basically keeping the enemy away and not allowing it to approach. For that, you need ideal intelligence in a real time, and clearly that's not coming right now. So I guess the situation is worse because of this. Question: can we afford to be encircled? No, absolutely we cannot. It's not worth it. And our commander is clearly watching this. We just had recently an announcement of our commander-in-chief that at the moment he doesn't see the encirclement as a real risk, but I'm sure that if he will see the real risk, I mean, they will be considering withdrawal.
Andriy, thank you very much for joining us here in France 24. We appreciate your time and we appreciate your frank response to our questions. Andriy Zagorodnyuk, former Defence Minister of Ukraine, advisor to the government of Volodymyr Zelensky, chairman of the Defence Centre and distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you, sir, for your time. Do take care of yourself over there in Ukraine, and thank you for joining us here on France 24. Thanks also to our international affairs